Hello friends, as the war between Ukraine and Russia is getting intensified, experts warn of the possibility of this war spreading to the Middle East. And if it does, chances are that its first impact would be felt in Syria. On 24th Feb, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad held a meeting within an hour of which Israel launched missile attacks on Damascus. Besides the damage inflicted by the attack, 3 Syrian government soldiers were reported dead. Friends, Syria is a war zone in the Middle East that holds interest for all the players in the region. In addition to Bashar al-Assad's regime, the involvement of Russia, USA, Turkey, Israel, Iran, and other independent rebel groups and non-state actors makes Syria a highly sensitive area. Further, its location between Europe and Asia makes it geostrategically important too. So any instability here would naturally affect the nations around. With the looming threat of the war spilling over, relations between Israel and Russia could only worsen. In Syria, there is growing confrontation between the armies of Russia and Israel, which has been a long time US ally. Friends, in today's video, we are going to discuss the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war if it spreads to the Middle East. Through this discussion, we will also explore the potential confrontation between Israel and Russia and understand if Israel can afford to stand up against Russia with the help of its Western allies. Friends, since 2011, Israel carried out hundreds of airstrikes on Syria. These attacks were launched when US and other NATO members declared war against Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. As US ally, Israel targeted Iranian forces and Hezbollah insurgents along with Syrian government positions. In this war waged by NATO, Russia and Iran provided military support to the Assad government, with which it was able to hold its ground against the opposing forces. While Russia had so far been silent on US-backed Israeli airstrikes on Syria, it strongly condemned Israeli air raids after the death of a soldier in the airstrikes of 9th Feb. After the visit of Russian Defense Minister, Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mikdad announced that the purpose of the visit was to send a message to the world that Russia and Syria are strong nations who are fighting the war to bring about global security and stability. Moreover, extending his support to Russia and President Putin, Mikdad said that he would recognize Luhansk and Donetsk as independent republics. Friends, not just Syria, but Iran too claims that the onus of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is on NATO since it provoked the invasion. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein categorically said that the Ukrainian crisis is rooted in NATO provocations. In the light of these developments, we have come to realize that the questions are being raised by Russia and its allies on the role of Western Bloc in the Middle East. Recently, Syrian and Russian fighter aircrafts conducted joint patrols along the Syrian border. Naval exercises were also carried out last week by Russian warships on the Syrian coast. The point of it all was to give US and its allies a glimpse of the aggression Russia is capable of. For Israel, the situation became serious when on 24th February, a drone from Lebanon successfully entered its airspace. Despite the Iron Dome air defense system being in place, the entry of this drone alarmed the Israeli military, which immediately activated air raid sirens. Many blame NATO for the potential war-like situation in Syria, given its imperialist strategy that gave rise to prolonged instability in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. This month, Lieutenant General Eric Kurilla, the head of the Central Command overlooking Middle Eastern operations, informed the Senate Armed Services Committee that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict could potentially spread to Syria. Friends, to understand Israel-Russia relations and the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on it, we will first have to understand the complexity of Syria and Israel's concerns regarding it. In 2015, when Russia had entered the Syrian war by providing air-power support to Bashar al-Assad's regime, the then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew to Russia for a meeting with Putin. A number of reports from that time suggested that Russia and Israel could possibly coordinate military actions in Syria. The joint setup to reduce misunderstanding between the two powers could have also worked as a deconfliction mechanism. However, post-2015 till today, things have changed a great deal. In those days, it seemed almost certain that Bashar al-Assad's regime was going to fall. But with time, Bashar al-Assad able to reconquer a large part of Syria with the help of the Russians and the Iranians. Today, Russia and Israel are pursuing separate agendas in Syria. While Russia wants a stable Syrian regime, Iran wants to take advantage of the Syrian government's weakness to supply weapons to Iranian bases and Hezbollah, like it had done in Iraq and Yemen. And Israel wants to prevent Iran from doing this at all cost. These vested and conflicting interests make the overall trend in Syria largely unclear. According to foreign media reports, Iran and Hezbollah are still trying to build up certain dangerous sites in Syria which can further destabilize the region. This is a concern that is echoed by the US forces posted at the Tanf garrison situated on the Jordanian border. Friends, amidst these conflicting agendas, Russia's major role in Syria is an issue that troubles Israel. Before Israel takes any stand on Ukraine, it needs to calculate all possible outcomes. So far, it has always supported the US on global issues. But this time, given Russia's involvement in Syria, it is going to be a tough call. The most immediate issue for Israel in Syria is the involvement of Iran and Hezbollah. And to deal with this, Israel needs to maintain a stable relationship with Russia. Perhaps for this reason, Israel's Prime Minister and Russia's Foreign Minister have given two separate responses regarding the Ukrainian crisis. Even though so far Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister Yair Lapid had maintained a cohesive foreign policy, they seem to be divided over the Ukraine-Russia conflict. While Yair Lapid forthrightly condemned Russia, Bennett issued a diplomatic statement to distance Israel from the war. The differing stance by the two leaders hint at the fact that Israel is trying to maintain a balance between its Western allies and the vested interest in Syria. There are more reasons behind not trying to upset Russia. According to Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Israel needs Russian clearance to fly over Syrian airspace. If Israel wants to continue its operation against Iran in Syria, it will have to secure Russia's tactical approval, without which it cannot further its interest in Syria. As long as these military operations remain relevant for Israel, it cannot afford to take any action against Russia. It makes it a dilemma for Israel to condemn Russia. One major objective of countering the Iranian-backed forces is to prevent the supply of Iranian weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon via Syria. So outrightly condemning Russia would hinder Israel's objective in Syria. Owing to this dilemma, Israel has been looking at ways to appease Russia. Last month, it denied weapon supplies to Ukraine that used to go via the Baltic states. Even though, before some days, Israel finally condemned the attacks on Ukraine, it refrained from taking Russia's name directly. This goes on to show how concerned Israel really is to prevent any confrontation with Russia over Syria. Friends, we had seen something similar back in 2014. When Israel abstained from voting in a United Nations General Assembly motion backed by the US to condemn Russia's annexation of Crimea. Even as European nations prepared themselves for an upcoming war in the wake of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, experts suggest that any further escalation of this conflict could have a severe impact on the Middle East. While the Taliban-led Afghan government did not take any anti-US stand against Syria and Iran, further instability in the region could give rise to the emergence of extremist forces. So friends, this was an analysis on a possible Russia-Israel conflict in the Middle East, especially in Syria. What's your opinion on this analysis? Is there any possibility of opening of this front or not? If you have liked the video, don't forget to share it with your friends. This is it for today's video. We will meet in next video. Till then, Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.